The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects. Rachel Torres stood in the employee locker room at Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk, holding her new badge with a photograph that didn't belong to her face. The name on it was real. The person it represented was not. She'd been dead for 6 months, officially. The Navy had erased Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres from every database, every roster, every photograph taken in theater. Orders had been explicit: disappear, assume a civilian identity, never surface again. The classified operation in Sangin Valley had gone sideways. People had died. Better people. And the people who sent her in decided the fastest solution was to erase the people who knew what really happened. The scrubs she'd pulled from her locker were 2 sizes too large, deliberately chosen from the donation bin. A forgettable smile would follow. A forgettable nurse. A forgettable woman. That had been the plan. But plans had a way of shattering. Rachel pulled the scrubs over her frame, noting the way the fabric hung loose around her shoulders. Good. Invisible was the goal. She'd spent 23 years making herself visible, learning to command rooms, to project authority, to make split-second decisions under fire that kept Marines alive. Now she would spend the next however long making herself as small as possible. The irony wasn't lost on her. She zipped the locker shut and slipped a faded unit patch from Sangin deeper into the zippered pocket of her jacket lining, her fingers lingering on the frayed edges. The patch was the size of a postage stamp, stitched in thread so old it had turned the color of rust. She'd kept it sewn inside her jacket for 8 years, close enough to touch but hidden enough that no one would ever ask questions about it. A talisman. A prayer. A ghost she carried. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hit her as she pushed through the swinging doors into the main corridor. Cold stainless steel gleamed under harsh white light. Monitors beeped in steady rhythm. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical breath. Sacred Heart's emergency department sprawled across her vision like the ribs of some great sleeping animal, all sharp angles and fluorescent glare and the particular silence that only hospitals possessed, a quiet where sound seemed to vanish into the white noise of machines keeping people alive. She'd worked in combat surgical theaters. She'd held pressure on wounds while helicopters shook the air above her head. This sterile, climate-controlled environment felt like a different planet entirely. Rachel Torres? A voice cut through the hum. She turned. The charge nurse was a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a clipboard. "That's me. You're on with us today for orientation. Dr. Hargrove usually does the morning rounds. He's chief of emergency medicine. You'll shadow him." The charge nurse's tone suggested this was not a good thing. Fair warning, he's particular about how things run. Rachel nodded once. Understood. By 8:15, Dr. Marcus Hargrove had arrived. He was tall enough to command a room by design rather than effort, expensive watch glinting under the lights, beard trimmed to the millimeter. He moved through Sacred Heart's corridors like someone accustomed to doors opening before he reached them. Rachel caught sight of him during the morning rounds, his white coat unbuttoned, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a trophy. He had the kind of posture that suggested he'd never been told no by anyone worth listening to. He sized her up in 4 seconds. The briefing happened in the cafeteria at 9 o'clock. Rachel was opening a container of yogurt she didn't want when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut across the noise of the crowd. He was standing with a cluster of attending physicians and residents, all of them turned toward her table. "This one won't last a week." He said it loud enough to carry. $20 says she cries by Friday. The other doctors laughed. Automatic. Reflexive. The kind of laugh that followed a superior's joke whether it landed or not. Rachel felt the attention settle on her like a weight. She kept her eyes on the yogurt container. 1 breath in. 1 breath out. She was a woman wearing scrubs 2 sizes too large. She was a temp nurse desperate for work. She was forgettable. That was the entire point. Anyone want to take that bet? Hargrove was enjoying himself now. Seriously. Look at her. First day jitters. You can see it. She did not look up. The yogurt needed her full attention. Not a talker. He said this as if it was a diagnosis. Makes sense. These are usually the ones who fold first. The quiet ones. He turned back to his audience. They come in thinking nursing is all angels and bedside manner. Then they realize we're running a combat zone here. By Thursday they're writing resignation letters. Rachel spooned yogurt into her mouth. The room smelled like reheated coffee and the particular staleness that only institutional cafeterias possessed. Nobody else was looking at her now except the residents, who were waiting to see if she'd crumble under observation like a structure with a load-bearing floor. She didn't crumble. By 3 o'clock on her second shift, Rachel was working the trauma bays. The job itself was not difficult, it was familiar. Follow protocol, monitor vitals, anticipate needs. The work of keeping people alive when the margins were measured in minutes. She'd done this in muddy surgical tents with the ground shaking. This was easier. Cleaner. Less chance of the patient bleeding out while someone screamed outside the tent about incoming mortars. That was when she saw room 312. The patient's chart identified him as Commander James Vega, United States Marine Corps, admitted 3 days ago with a traumatic brain injury sustained in a motor vehicle accident. Severe contusion to the left temporal lobe. Moderate swelling. The physicians were calling it fortunate he wasn't dead. The Marines would call it a miracle. Rachel knew both perspectives were wrong. She knew James Vega. Not in the way she knew other people. She knew him the way you know someone whose face you've memorized in a different lifetime, under different circumstances, when his eyes had held recognition and something that might have been gratitude if gratitude was a thing Marines said out loud. She'd carried him 3 miles through terrain that wanted to kill them both. She'd kept his blood inside his body while the world outside the perimeter was trying to use him for target practice. She'd whispered to him to stay with her, to keep breathing, to not die because if he died then none of it meant anything, not the weight of him across her shoulders, not the distance, not the choices. And now he lay in room 312 behind a monitor showing a steady sinus rhythm, his face unfamiliar even though it was exactly the same. The brain injury had stolen something. Not his life. Not his ability to breathe. Something smaller and infinitely worse. His ability to remember. Rachel stood at the foot of his bed with his chart in her hands, every muscle in her body perfectly still. The monitor beeped. The ventilator wheezed. The fluorescent lights hummed their insect hum. She was looking at a man she had saved, and he was looking through her as if she was part of the furniture. That was the moment she saw his forearm. The tattoo was crude, the kind of work done in a field with tools that weren't sterile, ink that wasn't meant for human skin, a hand that was shaking either from adrenaline or injury or both. Letters in a wavering line across his bicep. Rachel. Her name. Written in thread-thin letters that someone had stabbed into his skin with a needle and what was probably charcoal and blood and desperation. He'd gotten a tattoo. Of her name. And now he didn't remember her face. Rachel turned away from the bed, her hand steady on the chart. The nurse's station was 30 feet down the hallway. The bathroom was 20 feet in the opposite direction. She chose neither direction for the moment, instead standing in the shadows between the rooms where the fluorescent lights didn't quite reach. Her pulse remained stable. Her breathing didn't accelerate. These were things she'd controlled for 2 decades. She had been ordered to disappear. She had been told never to surface. But this man, this Marine, had carried her name written in his flesh like a prayer he'd said every day of his recovery, and he had no idea she'd ever existed. No idea she was standing 20 feet away, watching his chest rise and fall, reading the monitors that tracked the function of a brain that had scrubbed her away entirely. The shift lasted until 11 p.m. Rachel clocked out and walked to her car in a parking lot where the rain had started to fall, each drop catching the sodium light from the lampposts and turning into something that might have been beautiful if it didn't feel so much like falling. She sat in the driver's seat and did not start the engine. She did not allow her hands to shake. She did not call anyone because there was no one left to call. Rachel clocked in for her first shift at Sacred Heart in Norfolk wearing scrubs 2 sizes too big and a forgettable smile, just another temp nurse desperate for work. Dr. Hargrove, chief of emergency medicine, sized her up during morning rounds and announced a cafeteria bet loud enough for the entire staff to hear, "This one won't last a week, $20 as she cries by Friday." The nurses laughed. The residents smirked. Nobody disagreed. Hargrove smiled like a wolf showing teeth, and Rachel felt the weight of institutional power settle on her shoulders, the kind that had nothing to do with medical skill and everything to do with who controlled the schedule, the assignments, the recommendations. By day 3, the test came. The cafeteria at 11:11 a.m., peak staff hour. Rachel had grabbed a tray, turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee, and was heading toward the back corner where the temp staff Saturday. She moved with the economy of someone used to small spaces, minimal footprint, invisible presence. Hargrove stood near the serving line with 3 attending physicians, their white coats crisp and expensive. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply extended his arm as she passed, and his hand connected with the tray in one fluid motion. The turkey sandwich flipped through the air. The apple rolled across the tile floor like a wayward planet. Coffee splashed across her scrubs and hit her collarbone with heat that made her inhale sharply. The tray clattered, a sound like a dropped instrument tray in surgery, metallic and accusatory. Everyone stopped moving. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. The room went exactly as silent as a held breath. "Clumsy," Hargrove said, and his colleagues laughed the kind of laugh that wanted an audience and got one. "Maybe get some larger scrubs, sweetheart. You're swimming in those." He didn't apologize. Apologies would have required seeing her as a person worth the courtesy. Instead, he walked back to his physicians, still talking about the cardiomyopathy case on 3 North, and nobody at the serving line looked at Rachel. The invisible rule had been set, she was fair game. She was the agreed-upon target. Rachel felt the burn on her collarbone. Pain was information. She'd learned that in field medicine under mortar fire in Helmand Province, and she did not allow her eyes to water. Not yet. Not here. She grabbed paper towels from the dispenser, knelt, and picked up the apple and the shattered pieces of ceramic from the tray. A younger nurse, maybe 23, dark hair pulled back in a bun, started to help her. Hargrove said, without looking, "Leave it, Chen. She's got it." Chen straightened, glanced apologetically at Rachel, and walked away. Rachel cleaned the spill alone while the cafeteria resumed eating around her like water flowing around a stone. The second scene came 8 hours later. Evening shift, 1938, the charting station near the trauma bays where the night crew was just arriving. Rachel had been organizing patient charts in the rack, room 308, room 310, room 312. Her hands moved with precision born from 3 tours in unpredictable combat medicine, each chart placed exactly where it belonged, every detail aligned. Hargrove approached with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been told no by an institution. He didn't say anything. He simply reached down, took the stack of charts Rachel had just organized, 7 of them, representing 7 patients, representing 7 lives she was assigned to monitor, and dropped them at her feet. The papers scattered like leaves. Some slid under the desk. Some fanned across the floor in a display of chaos. He sighed theatrically, the kind of sigh that demanded witnesses, and stepped directly over the spreading papers. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Try not to lose any this time." He said it loud enough that the 3 nurses restocking the trauma bay heard it. Loud enough that the resident signing out heard it. Loud enough that it became data transmitted through the ward. She was incompetent, she was careless, she was the kind of nurse who deserved the small indignities. Rachel stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Her hands, those same hands that had performed needle decompression on a collapsed lung in a Taliban-controlled compound, that had held intestines inside a body cavity with gauze and prayer, were steady as surgical steel. Her breathing was controlled. Her heart rate did not spike. She was trained to separate emotion from action, fear from data, humiliation from response. She took one measured breath. She knelt. She began collecting the scattered charts, checking each one to ensure none were damaged, organizing them again with the same methodical precision. A single tear escaped as she worked. Just one. She didn't wipe it away immediately. Instead, she let it run down her cheek while maintaining eye contact with Hargrove, who was waiting for the breakdown he'd paid money to witness. The tear reached her jaw. She finally wiped it, unhurried, and stood. The charts were reorganized. Her voice, when she spoke, was exactly level. "I've had harder landings than this, Doctor." The words landed in the silence like a dropped coin in an empty corridor. Hargrove's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Rachel to see the flicker of something unspoken cross his face. That night, Rachel worked the evening shift managing 4 patients while the night crew trickled in at 11 p.m. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the persistent drone of insects in summer heat. She checked vitals, documented intake and output, monitored the cardiac monitors with the attentive focus of someone who understood that every number on a screen represented a human being's fragile remaining time on Earth. Commander Vega's O2 sat at 94%. His blood pressure was holding at 128/78. His pupils were equal and reactive. The monitors painted a picture of stability that was itself dangerous, bodies injured as severely as his often looked stable until they suddenly weren't. She had seen it before. She had held men's hands as they coded without warning. The hospital settled into the rhythm of night shift, that strange suspended time between midnight and dawn when the census dropped, the visitors left, and the critical cases became even more critical in the darkness. At 2:51 a.m., Vega's breathing changed. Not dramatically. Not obviously. But noticeably. The rate increased from 16 breaths per minute to 22. The depth shallowed. Rachel was reviewing his chart from the desk when the change registered in her peripheral awareness, not as a number on the monitor, but as a sound. The ventilator whooshed its rhythmic assist less efficiently. She moved to his bed without calling for help, muscle memory taking over the way it did in forward surgical teams when there was no time for protocol. She did a rapid assessment. The right side of his chest was hyperresonant. The trachea was deviated slightly to the left. His neck veins were distended. The symptoms locked into a diagnosis with the certainty of a rifle bolt closing, tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed. The pressure was building inside his chest cavity, pushing his heart toward the left side of his body, crushing the space his organs needed to function. Without intervention, his heart would arrest within minutes. The monitors hadn't flagged it yet. The attending wasn't here. Protocol said to call the senior resident and wait for evaluation. Protocol said a temp nurse from an outside agency did not make diagnostic calls or perform procedures beyond her scope. Rachel grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart and stepped toward the patient. "Step back." A voice from the doorway. Hargrove. Disheveled scrubs, sleepy-eyed, moving with the sluggish approach of someone pulled from a cool room. "I said step back." It wasn't a request. It was a command shaped like a doctor's authority. Rachel's hand froze halfway to the patient's second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact spot where the needle needed to go to release the pressure and save the man's life. She looked at Hargrove. She looked back at Vega, whose oxygen sat was already dropping. 93, 91. 89, falling. His lung collapsed, she said. Tension pneumothorax. He's got maybe 2 minutes before. I'm aware of the anatomy, Hargrove interrupted. He was moving to the bedside now, but slowly, confidently, the way a man moves when he's certain he's the smartest person in the room. We wait for the chest tube kit. We do this properly. But properly took time. Properly meant wheeling him to the procedure bay. Properly meant a 24-minute minimum from recognition to needle, and Rachel could read the monitor the same way Hargrove could read it. Vega's O2 dropped to 87. His heart rate climbed to 142. The pressure was building inside his chest like a fist clenching around his heart. Rachel didn't argue. She did not say another word. She simply moved. The needle slid between his ribs with the precision of someone who'd done field medicine in sandstorms, under fire, with nothing but her hands and her training and the sound of mortars landing 200 meters away. The catheter advanced. The rush of air escaped, the distinctive hiss that meant pressure releasing, pressure that would have killed him in 30 seconds. Vega's oxygen immediately climbed. 89, 92. 96, his heart rate dropped. His blood pressure stabilized. The monitors hummed their approval. Hargrove stood frozen at the foot of the bed, and the expression on his face shifted from anger to something colder, something that looked like calculation. "You just exceeded your scope of practice," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a fact he was filing away. "You performed a procedure you're not authorized to perform." "He would have arrested," Rachel said. She was already retrieving a sterile dressing from the supply cart, moving with the calm of someone who'd made impossible choices in places where there were no good options. "You would have been 2 minutes too slow." Hargrove left the room without another word. Rachel finished securing the needle site, documented every detail of the procedure, and called the attending, who arrived 5 minutes later and nodded approvingly at the decompression, never knowing it hadn't been him who ordered it. She did not allow her hands to shake. She did not allow her voice to change tone. She simply continued the work of saving lives in a hospital that had decided she didn't belong, wearing a false identity, carrying a secret so classified that the government had ordered her to disappear, and praying that Commander Vega would wake up with his memory intact, or that he would forget her completely, because if he remembered, everything she'd spent 18 months trying to hide would collapse like a lung without oxygen. At 3:06 a.m., the ventilator's rhythm changed. The wheeze became shallow, labored, like a lung drowning in its own collapse. Rachel's eyes snapped open. She'd been sitting in the chair beside Vega's bed for 3 hours, watching the monitors the way combat medics watch a perimeter, not looking for comfort, looking for threats. The soft beeping of the pulse oximeter had been her lullaby. Now it was her alarm. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 94, 91. 88. She moved before thinking. Her hands were already reaching for the light, already reading the monitors with the clarity of someone who'd done this in sandstorms, in the back of a Humvee, in a ditch while rounds snapped overhead. His trachea. She saw it immediately. Deviated sharply to the left. Tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed, and now the pressure was building, crushing his good lung, pushing his heart aside like furniture in a room getting smaller. Without intervention, he had minutes. Rachel pulled the curtain around the bed and reached for his monitor lead, checking the electrocardiogram. The rhythm was compensating, fighting. 112 beats per minute. His body screaming without sound. She placed her palm on his right chest wall, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy she could read like a map she'd carried her entire life. 17 Marines. Sangin Valley. 3 miles. The weight of each one still lived in her muscle memory. The room was dark except for the monitor glow. She had maybe 8 minutes before this became irreversible. Rachel pressed the call button for the attending physician. The system crackled. She was supposed to wait. That was protocol. That was the rule that kept young nurses in their lanes and kept doctors in their thrones. She was supposed to watch a man suffocate while waiting for Dr. Hargrove to finish whatever he was doing in the parking lot or the lounge or the administrative hallway where incompetence moved slowly and deliberately. The door opened. Footsteps. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, still pulling on his white coat, his hair disheveled, his face creased from the left side where he'd been sleeping in his car, or somewhere that required him to arrive 17 minutes after the crisis call. He took in the scene, Rachel standing with her hand on Vega's chest, the monitors screaming their numbers, the patient's eyes wide and drowning. "Step back," Hargrove said. Not a request. An order wrapped in the authority of a man who'd never had to earn anything except tenure. His tracheas deviated, Rachel said. Her voice was level. Tension pneumothorax. His decompensating. "I'm aware of his condition, Nurse Torres." Hargrove moved to the monitor, taking his time, performing competence like an actor who'd memorized the blocking but never understood the role. "We'll wait for the attending. This is not your patient to manage." Rachel did not move. She was looking at Vega's face. At the panic there. At the way his eyes found hers even though his brain couldn't place her, and something in him, some survival instinct deeper than memory, knew she was the only one in this room who could bring him back. Oxygen saturation, 84. 81. "Doctor, I need to perform needle decompression. Now. You need to follow protocol. There's a difference." She did not argue. Arguing required the luxury of time. Instead, her hands moved. Years of field medicine under fire don't negotiate with bureaucrats. She reached for the emergency cart, her movements precise as a surgical laser, found the 14-gauge angiocath needle, and turned back to Vega's chest. Her fingers located the space between his ribs with the certainty of someone who'd done this in darkness, in chaos, while holding her own breath. "Stand down," Hargrove said. His voice had changed. It carried threat now because he could feel the shifting in the room, the invisible moment when protocol died and survival took its place. Rachel inserted the needle. The anatomy was truth. The body doesn't care about hierarchy or hospital policy. The needle slid through the intercostal muscles, found the pleural space, and then, the hiss. The sound of a lung re-inflating like a balloon, like pressure releasing, like air escaping from a tire that had been holding the car up. The hiss that meant she'd just given this man back his life. She attached the catheter, securing it with the same hands that had held 17 Marines in the Sangin Valley while medevac helicopters cut the sky into pieces. The monitors began their climb immediately. O2 sat climbing, 81. 85, 88. 92, 94. Stable. The heart rate settled. 112, 106. 98, 88. Normal. Vega's body relaxed. The panic left his eyes. He didn't know her, but his body remembered that she was the one who brought him back from the edge. Hargrove said nothing. He was standing at the foot of the bed, watching the monitors climb like a man watching his career descend. Rachel could see the calculation moving behind his eyes. He knew what he'd just witnessed. More than that, he knew what it meant. This wasn't a temp nurse with oversized scrubs. This was someone whose hands had done this before, whose body had muscle memory that only came from doing this under real pressure, under mortar fire, under circumstances that teaching hospitals couldn't simulate and policy manuals couldn't cover. She turned to him with her eyes perfectly clear. "I'm staying with him. 10 hours. Maybe 12. I'm not leaving this monitor unattended. Not tonight." It wasn't a request. That was the moment when Hargrove heard it, heard the voice underneath the words. The voice that had carried orders, that had kept people alive in places where the only law was physics and biology and the refusal to accept failure. It was a voice he recognized from his own father's military stories, the voice of someone who'd spent more time in the field than she'd spent in hospitals, and that terrified him because authority like that couldn't be challenged with a memo or a board decision. "Fine," he said. "But this goes into your file. Insubordination. Protocol violation." She didn't answer. She'd already turned back to Vega, already pulled the chair closer, already settled into the vigil that would define the next 10 hours. Watching his chest rise and fall. Monitoring every breath like it was her own. Checking the fall lines. Adjusting the oxygen. Reading the monitors the way some people read scripture, for guidance, for reassurance, for the promise that she could keep this man alive through the night. Hargrove left without another word, but his footsteps were fast now, purposeful in a way they hadn't been when he arrived. She heard him in the hallway, already on his phone, already making calls, the kind of calls that men like him made when they realized they were losing control. When they decided that if they couldn't break you with public humiliation, they would break you with the slow machinery of institutional power. Calls to board members. Calls to HR, calls to the people who owed him favors and who could make a temp nurse's false background unravel like a sweater coming loose. But Rachel didn't hear those calls. She was somewhere else now, somewhere deeper. 10 hours. 3 miles through Sangin. A Marine with her name on his skin who'd forgotten her face but whose body hadn't forgotten anything. The monitors beat their steady rhythm, and she settled into the kind of focus that only comes when everything else falls away and there's only this, the patient, the numbers, the breath moving in and out, the refusal to fail. The night stretched ahead like a runway. And she was ready. By morning, Hargrove had already made the first call. His voice carried across the hospital administrator's office with the casual authority of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. 3 board members on speed dial. 2 retired hospital directors who owed him favors from staffing negotiations 5 years back. 1 connection to the licensing board itself, a woman whose daughter had gotten into Johns Hopkins through a letter of recommendation he'd written. The network was vast and invisible and hungry. He started with Rachel's references. The call to her supposed previous employer in Charleston took 40 minutes. By the time Hargrove hung up, he was smiling. That hospital had no record of anyone named Rachel Torres. Not in the last decade. Not ever. He pulled up her application materials again, reading the fabricated credentials with the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally found the trap door. The staffing agency that had placed her? Hargrove made his second call by 7:17 a.m. His voice dropped an octave when he explained the situation. He wasn't asking questions. He was activating something older than protocol, the unspoken agreement between institutions to protect themselves. By 8:45 a.m., investigators from outside were already in the hospital's administrative offices. 2 of them, 1 woman with a digital recorder and a folder of documents, 1 man whose job title existed only on business cards no one had ever seen clearly. They carried the weight of people accustomed to finding what others wanted to hide. Hargrove had given them exactly 1 name and 1 instruction: background verification on nursing credentials. What they found in the next 4 hours would change everything, though neither investigator could have predicted it. The falsified credentials unraveled like a sweater pulled by the wrong thread. The nursing license number didn't match. The reference hospitals had never heard of her. Her social security number, when cross-referenced against databases that no private citizen could access, showed no employment history before Sacred Heart. Nothing. The woman had appeared in Norfolk like condensation on glass, present but unexplainable. The investigators made notes in their quiet, methodical way. People who worked in background verification understood that sometimes absence was more telling than presence. Rachel found out at 11:22 a.m. when the hospital's HR director called her into an office that suddenly felt very small. The woman, Margaret, who'd been kind during Rachel's orientation 3 days ago, wouldn't meet her eyes. There was a folder on the desk. Rachel understood, before any words were spoken, that her time at Sacred Heart had an expiration date. "We've received some concerning information regarding your employment application," Margaret said carefully. "Outside investigators have flagged inconsistencies in your background documentation. Until we can resolve this matter, we're suspending you pending termination proceedings." Rachel didn't ask questions. Asking questions meant defending herself, and defending herself meant constructing a narrative that didn't exist. She nodded once. "Understood. You'll need to surrender your badge and your access credentials immediately." She unpinned the badge from her scrubs. Sacred Heart Hospital, in white letters on blue plastic. It had felt like camouflage for exactly 72 hours. She set it on the desk with the precision of placing a folded flag. The locker room was empty at 12:08 p.m. Most of the day shift was already on the floors. Rachel turned the combination twice, her birthday, backwards, a habit from Sangin where you never used obvious numbers, and the door swung open. 3 uniforms hanging side by side. Her name on a piece of masking tape. 1 pair of shoes with the laces tied in a double knot. And beneath everything, tucked into a side pocket where it had lived for 18 months, the faded unit patch. Sewn into the lining of her old jacket, the one she never wore anymore because wearing it meant carrying everything. She held it for exactly 4 seconds. The material was rough, frayed at the edges where she'd stitched it 1,000 times with the kind of focus that made people look away. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook anymore. But something in her chest cracked, just slightly, the way concrete fractures before the whole thing gives way. She packed the cardboard box the HR director had given her. Clothes. The patch. Her shoes. Her certification cards, still valid, suddenly useless. She didn't look back at the empty locker. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. At 1:41 p.m., she walked out of Sacred Heart Hospital and nobody watched her leave. The drive to Arlington took 2 hours and 13 minutes in the rain. She knew because she watched the clock the entire way, needing something external to focus on. The windshield wipers beat out a rhythm like a heartbeat. The radio played nothing. Just static and the sound of her own breathing and the highway beneath her tires. The cemetery gates opened. They always did. She'd been coming here for 3 years on her 1 day off each month, always at odd hours when the groundskeeper was elsewhere, always in the same reverent silence. But this time the rain was sheets. Actual sheets, the kind that turned the grass to mud and made the world look drowned. Commander Marcus Torres, 1989 to 2019. Killed in action, Helmand Province. No details. No classified operation designation. Just a name on stone and a flag that had been replaced by the rain exactly 47 times. She knelt. Mud soaked through her jeans immediately, cold and real and unforgiving. Her voice came out like something from underwater. I tried to stay hidden like you asked, Marcus. I took the new name. I stayed quiet. I followed every rule they gave me. She pressed her palms flat against the stone. Rain ran between her fingers. But there was a Marine in that hospital, and his lung was collapsing, and I couldn't just watch him die. I couldn't. The rain hammered harder. Her shoulders curved forward the way shoulders do when the weight becomes too much. But she still wasn't crying. She was beyond crying. She was at the place where tears stop mattering because the damage is already done. They knew I was lying. About everything. It took them 3 days, but they found the cracks. Now I'm nobody again. Except this time I'm not hiding. I'm just gone. She sat there for 12 minutes in the rain with her hands on her dead husband's grave. Then she stood up, because soldiers stand up, and she walked back to her car with mud coating her shoes and her jacket soaked through and something inside her hollowed out like a bell that had rung itself silent. The parking garage at the hospital was still available to her as an employee. They hadn't deactivated her access yet. She'd learned a long time ago that the smallest windows of time often held the most power. She pulled into Space B-47, 3rd level, and sat with the engine running while the rain hammered the roof. Her phone had 17 missed calls. She didn't check who they were from. At 3:52 p.m., sitting alone in the dark with nothing but the sound of the rain and the idle engine, she reached for the unit patch. She held it in both hands. She thought about throwing it out into the rain and letting it wash away. She thought about burning it. She thought about walking back into that grave and burying it there with Marcus. But then she heard something. So faint at first she thought she'd imagined it. Then again. A distant sound cutting through the rain and the engine noise and the static of her own despair. Rotors. Moving closer. She didn't know what was about to land on the helipad 8 floors above her. She didn't know that while she'd been sitting at her husband's grave, Commander Vega had woken up, truly awake, not the sedated half-consciousness of the previous nights, and the first thing he'd asked was, "Where is she? Where's the nurse who saved me?" She didn't know that his daughter, a young Marine lieutenant who'd flown in on emergency leave, had heard those words and immediately called every military contact she had. She didn't know that within minutes, those contacts had started pulling classified records that should never have been disturbed. She didn't know that at 4:06 p.m., a UH-60M Black Hawk was touching down on Sacred Heart's helipad with 4 Navy SEALs and a Rear Admiral whose job was to clean up situations that had leaked into civilian spaces. All Rachel knew, sitting alone in her car on the third level of a parking garage with her dead husband's unit patch in her hands and nothing left to lose, was that her pulse had quickened and the rain suddenly didn't feel quite as heavy. The helicopter descended lower, rotors powerful enough to shake the concrete beneath her. The sound echoed through the parking garage like thunder moving closer. She set the patch on the dashboard carefully, as though it might break. She didn't turn off the engine. She didn't move. And then her phone rang. The phone rang at 11:13 a.m. Rachel didn't answer it. She sat in her car in the parking garage, hands still on the steering wheel, rain drumming the roof in irregular patterns. The caller ID read unknown. It rang again. And again. On the fourth ring, she picked up. Senior Chief Torres. Not a question. A male voice, clipped, military bearing even through the speaker. This is Lieutenant Commander Graves, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. We have a bird inbound to Sacred Heart's helipad. ETA 12 minutes. Stand by. The line went dead. Rachel's hands didn't move from the wheel. 12 minutes. She'd spent for years running from a phone call that would say her name. Now it had. She pulled the faded unit patch from her jacket pocket, the one she'd kept sewn in the lining since Sangin, the piece of fabric that had traveled 3 miles through enemy fire pressed against her ribs. Her hands were steady. That was the only thing that mattered now. The UH-60 Black Hawk descended through the Norfolk sky like a judgment, rotors hammering the air into submission. From the ER windows, nurses watched it touch down on the helipad at 11:59 a.m. No emergency lights. No scramble. This was controlled. Purposeful. A Navy SEAL team emerged first, 6 operators moving with the terrifying fluid precision of men who'd spent careers in places most people couldn't imagine. They wore dress uniforms. Someone was coming home. The hospital erupted. Within 90 seconds, the atrium filled with staff. Word traveled like electricity, something's happening. Who is it? I don't know. The SEALs moved through the crowd with the parting effect of a blade through water, and behind them came a young Marine lieutenant in dress blues, a uniform sharp enough to cut glass, her eyes scanning the assembled faces with methodical intensity. Dr. Hargrove appeared at the atrium's edge, his white coat flapping like a cape he'd forgotten he was wearing. His face was already calculating angles, already spinning narrative. He stepped forward, extending a hand. Gentlemen, if there's a medical situation, we're equipped to. The SEAL team leader didn't acknowledge him. He moved directly to the lieutenant, nodded once, and then his voice carried across the atrium like a command at parade rest, Senior Chief Torres. We're looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. She's here. The room went dead silent. Hargrove's hand dropped. His jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, closed it. Rachel moved through the crowd, not fast, not slow. The way she'd learned to move in places where speed meant panic and panic meant death. The lieutenant's eyes locked onto hers the moment she stepped into the open, and something flickered across the younger woman's face. Recognition of something. Not of her face. Of her bearing. I'm Rachel Torres, she said. The lieutenant stepped forward. Her voice carried the steel of command even at 28. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. My father is Commander James Vega, Marine Corps. He told me to find you. She paused, and her next words were careful, deliberate, the way soldiers speak when witnessing something sacred. He told me you carried him 3 miles through enemy fire in Sangin. He told me you're the reason he came home. Hargrove's face drained of color like someone had pulled a drain plug. A trembling nurse, the same one who'd helped wheel Vega in during that first night, stepped forward with a sealed file in her hands. Her fingers shook as she opened it. She began reading, her voice climbing in pitch with each line, 2 silver stars. She looked up, shocked, then back down. 3 bronze stars with Vela. Her hands were shaking now. She turned the page. Navy Cross. The words fell into the atrium like stones into still water. For extraordinary heroism beyond the call of duty during classified operations in support of Fleet Surgical Team 8. The SEAL team leader stepped into the center of the atrium. Every eye in the room moved to him. His voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. It had the weight of certainty. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres is a decorated combat medic who saved 17 Marines during operations that don't officially exist. She was assigned to Fleet Surgical Team 8 and operated in conditions most of you cannot imagine. She's been living under federal witness protection protocols since her discharge. And she just saved a Marine commander's life in your trauma bay without revealing her identity. He turned slightly, and his gaze found Hargrove like a weapon-acquiring target lock. A rear admiral stepped through the crowd, someone who'd been standing in the back of the atrium the entire time, silent, observing. His uniform was immaculate. His expression was the kind carved from decades of making decisions that ended careers. He approached Hargrove slowly, and with each step, Hargrove's shoulders rose higher, his breathing shallower. Dr. Hargrove. The admiral didn't extend his hand. You are hereby terminated for obstructing a protected service member operating under federal witness security protocols and for active interference with medical care for a patient under your supervision. You will surrender your hospital credentials, your DEA number, and your medical license to the hospital administrator within the hour. Security will escort you from the premises. The admiral turned to face the assembled staff. Dr. Hargrove is no longer employed at Sacred Heart. That is final. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. He looked like a man watching his reflection shatter. He started to speak, then seemed to realize the entire room was staring at him, nurses, residents, attending physicians, orderlies, volunteers. All of them. His hands trembled. He turned and walked toward the exit, each step smaller than the last, the authority draining from his posture like fluid from a wound. 6 months later, the sun was sharp and cold on Dress Blues. Rachel stood beside Commander Vega in front of Sacred Heart's new combat trauma wing, a $4.2 million facility dedicated to treating military personnel and veterans. The plaque read, "In honor of those who carry the burden. In tribute to those who answer the call." Vega's hand shook as he reached into the glass case. Inside was the unit patch, the one Rachel had kept sewn into her jacket lining since Sangin. Faded. Worn. A prayer in cotton. He lifted it slowly, reverently, the way a soldier handles the flag of the fallen. She'd never told him it was her patch. Never told him anything. But his daughter had. The hospital had. The admiral had. His eyes met hers. He didn't speak. Some things are too large for language. He pinned it to the wall of remembrance, and it caught the light like something that had finally come home. 3 blocks away, in the parking lot outside a strip mall on Military Highway, a man in a wrinkled polo shirt stood behind a folding table covered with insurance brochures. His name tag read, Steve. A hospital volunteer passing through recognized him and didn't look back. The man flinched when a customer called him by his old title, not from pride, but from shame. He'd been Dr. Hargrove once. He'd had a network. He'd had prestige. He'd had the kind of power that comes from being underestimated by people too afraid to question his authority. Now he sold policies for commission. His apartment was a studio. His ex-wife had changed her phone number. His medical license sat in a drawer, revoked, never to be restored. He'd made calls to board members. They hadn't returned them. He'd tried to leverage old favors. They'd evaporated. The institution he'd thought would protect him had simply moved on, as institutions do, erasing him the way he'd tried to erase Rachel Torres. But Rachel Torres had been invisible on purpose. He'd chosen to be forgotten. In room 312, now called the Vega Suite, a young Marine who couldn't remember the face of the woman who'd carried him through hell watched her walk past his window in Dress Blues, her rank shoulder boards finally visible to the world. His daughter stood beside him. She squeezed his hand. "There she is, Dad." their senior chief Torres. He wept. Not from gratitude. From the terrible understanding that he'd lived because someone loved him enough to carry him even when he couldn't love her in return. That was the real heroism. Not the medals. Not the rank. The carrying. The staying. The 10 hours at his bedside when no one would help her. The kind of love that asks nothing in return. This is what happens when you underestimate the quiet person in the room. When you mistake invisible strength for weakness. When you weaponize your authority against someone whose authority you never understood in the first place. Rachel Torres didn't need a uniform to be dangerous. She needed her hands. Her knowledge. Her refusal to let another person die when she could prevent it. True class is what you do when the lights go out. Here's my question for you. If you discovered a coworker was a war hero living under a false identity to follow military orders, would you have recognized them? Or would you have done what Dr. Hargrove did, see only what you expected to see? Subscribe for more stories about the people we overlook. Like this video if you believe hidden strength is the most dangerous kind. And comment, what would you do if you discovered someone you'd been dismissing was actually protecting all of you?